On April 6, 1945, the largest battleship ever built left port on a mission its own crew understood, before they'd even cleared the harbor, was designed to kill nearly all of them. The Yamato carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Her orders were to reach the waters off Okinawa, beach herself if she made it that far, and fight as a stationary fortress until she was destroyed. She never made it, and her doomed voyage was only the opening move of a campaign that would go on to become the single deadliest naval battle in the history of the United States Navy, deadlier than Pearl Harbor, fought not against Japanese battleships or carriers, but against waves of aircraft whose pilots had no intention of returning home at all and had been told as much before they ever climbed into the cockpit. This is the story of the Kamikaze campaign at Okinawa. By early 1945, Japan's conventional navy had been effectively broken beyond any hope of meaningful repair. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. The previous October had crippled what remained of the fleet that once ruled the Pacific, sinking or disabling so many major surface combatants that Japanese naval planners no longer had any realistic path to contesting an American invasion fleet ship for ship. What they did still have was aircraft, thousands of them, many of them obsolete trainers with no realistic chance of surviving conventional aerial combat against modern American fighters, flown by pilots whose training had been cut short by fuel shortages and the sheer speed of Japan's collapsing war effort. At Leyte Gulf, a small number of pilots had already demonstrated something that changed how Japanese commanders thought about their remaining aircraft entirely and permanently. Even an obsolete, poorly flown plane, in the hands of a pilot with nothing left to lose, could sink or cripple a warship if he simply flew it directly into the target instead of trying to survive an attack run and return home to fight another day. Imperial General Headquarters drew the obvious, horrifying conclusion from that evidence. On April 1, 1945, the same day American troops began landing on Okinawa itself, Japanese command ordered the conversion of nearly every available Army and Navy aircraft into a special attack weapon. The Japanese called the coordinated mass version of these attacks Operation Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums. 10 of these mass attacks would be launched against the American fleet over the following 11 weeks. The campaign's opening act came from an unlikely direction. When Japanese military leaders briefed Emperor Hirohito on their defense plans for Okinawa, explaining the aerial kamikaze strategy the Army and Navy had settled on, the emperor reportedly asked a pointed question: what was the Navy doing to help defend Okinawa? Did Japan have no more ships left at all? Stung by the implication that the Navy was sitting out the battle entirely while the Army and its pilots absorbed all the sacrifice, Admiral Soemu Toyoda's command conceived a mission for the one capital ship still available. The battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, would sail for Okinawa alongside a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, carrying only enough fuel to reach the battle and none to return, with orders to fight as a beached gun platform once she arrived, using her enormous main guns to shell American forces ashore for as long as she could hold together. It was, in effect, a decision to turn the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy into a kamikaze weapon in its own right. She departed on April 6th, timed deliberately to coincide with the opening kamikaze mass strike, Kikusui No. 1, so that American attention and resources would already be stretched thin across multiple simultaneous threats. She never got the chance to carry out any part of that plan. American reconnaissance spotted the force well before it reached Okinawa, and on April 7th, Task Force 58's carrier aircraft, launched from multiple fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, caught Yamato in the open water of the East China Sea, well short of her destination. Wave after wave of American torpedo planes and dive bombers hit her over roughly 2 hours, roughly 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs by the final count, until the world's largest battleship rolled over and exploded, taking more than 3,000 of her crew down with her. 4 of her escorting destroyers went down as well, along with the light cruiser Yahagi. American losses in the entire engagement came to just 10 aircraft, a lopsided outcome that made unmistakably clear the era of the battleship as the dominant weapon of naval warfare had ended. While Yamato was still steaming toward her destruction, the first Kikusui mass air raid was already underway, and it revealed immediately who was actually going to bear the worst of this new kind of warfare. To give the fleet advance warning of incoming kamikazes, the Navy had stationed destroyers on radar picket duty in a ring around Okinawa, positioned specifically in the path any attacking aircraft would have to fly through on their way from bases in Japan and Formosa. It made those destroyers, in effect, the tripwire of the entire fleet's air defense, and the first thing a wave of suicide pilots would encounter. Pilots under orders to hit the first American vessel they came across had little reason to fly past a destroyer in search of something bigger and better defended further back in the anchorage. On April 6th alone, out of roughly 700 Japanese aircraft launched, American carrier planes and anti-aircraft fire shot down around 400 of them before they ever reached a ship. Close to 200 kamikazes got through anyway. The destroyer Hainsworth became the first ship hit. The destroyers Bush and Colquhoun were sunk outright. 5 kamikazes slammed into the destroyer Newcomb in succession. A 6th, coming in low, skipped across the water and struck the destroyer Leutze as she moved in to help her stricken sister ship. Radar picket duty in the space of a single afternoon had revealed itself as one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire United States Navy. A role that would go on to define the rest of the campaign for the destroyer crews assigned to it, men who described the psychological strain of the duty itself as almost as exhausting as combat, simply knowing an attack was coming without ever knowing exactly when. It only got worse from there. 9 more mass Kikusui strikes followed over the next 11 weeks, interspersed with near-constant smaller raids that never really let the fleet's air defenses rest for more than a day or two at a time. Kikusui No. 2 in mid-April introduced a new and even more frightening weapon, the Ohka, a small rocket-powered piloted flying bomb carried partway to its target, slung beneath a conventional bomber, before being released to accelerate toward a ship at speeds well over 600 miles an hour. Fast enough that conventional anti-aircraft fire had almost no time to react once the weapon was actually released and committed to its final dive. American sailors with characteristically dark wartime humor born of living under constant threat nicknamed it baka, a Japanese word roughly meaning fool or idiot, a small act of defiance against a weapon that genuinely terrified everyone who served on picket duty once word of it spread through the fleet. The destroyer Manert El Abeli became the first ship destroyed by one, struck by a conventional kamikaze first and then finished off by an Ohka that hit her forward fire room and broke the ship's back almost instantly. The destroyer Kidd took a kamikaze hit on April 11th that killed 38 of her crew and wounded 55 more, nearly a third of everyone aboard, and her surviving crew fought the fires and kept the ship afloat regardless, eventually sailing her home for repairs rather than joining the growing list of ships lost outright. She survives today as a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, one of the more tangible reminders of exactly what picket duty at Okinawa actually cost the men who drew that assignment. The single worst day for any American warship during the entire campaign came on May 11th during Kikusui No. 6. USS Bunker Hill, an Essex-class carrier serving as flagship for Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's entire fast carrier task force, was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds of each other, while her flight deck was crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch, almost exactly the same lethal combination of circumstances that had already devastated the carrier Franklin 2 months earlier off the coast of Japan. A coincidence of timing and vulnerability that would come to define the entire Okinawa carrier campaign. Fires spread through Bunker Hill's hangar and flight decks with terrifying speed, fed by the same combination of aviation fuel and armed ordnance that had turned Franklin into an inferno 2 months earlier, and by the time her crew finally brought the fires under control after hours of desperate fighting, close to 400 men were dead. Mitcher himself survived, transferring his flag to another carrier so the fleet could keep fighting without missing a beat, but Bunker Hill's own war was over. She limped back to the United States for repairs that kept her out of the war for good. one of only two Essex-class carriers, alongside Franklin, that never returned to active service after the damage they suffered in these final months of the war. Kikusui No. 6 alone, that single mass strike, cost more than 460 American lives, the second costliest of all 10 Kikusui operations, trailing only the opening assault on April 6th. The toll kept accumulating ship by ship through the following weeks. Small landing craft support vessels, barely armed and often assigned to escort the Picket destroyers, were hit again and again. A dozen of them damaged or sunk over the course of the campaign, with dozens more sailors killed aboard ships most people have never heard of. Vessels too small and too numerous for any single one of them to become as famous as Bunker Hill or Yamato, even though their crews faced exactly the same terror on exactly the same picket stations. Individual destroyers earned their own grim reputations for survival against odds that should have sunk them outright several times over, absorbing kamikaze hit after kamikaze hit over the course of a single afternoon, and somehow staying afloat through sheer damage control tenacity, shooting down attacker after attacker, even as their own decks burned beneath their feet. Even after the last of the 10-mast Kikusui operations wound down in June, as Japan began holding back its remaining aircraft to defend the home islands against the invasion everyone now expected, individual kamikaze attacks kept coming, never quite letting the fleet relax its guard. As late as July 29, 1945, weeks after organized resistance on Okinawa itself had ended, the destroyer Callahan was sunk by a lone kamikaze pilot flying nothing more sophisticated than an old fabric and wood biplane, a weapon so outdated it barely registered as a threat on radar, a reminder that Japan's willingness to keep sending pilots on one-way missions didn't end just because the battle for the island itself had. When the fighting around Okinawa finally stopped, the tally made it, by a wide margin, the costliest naval battle in the history of the United States Navy. 36 American ships had been sunk outright. Depending on how the count is made, somewhere between 200 and nearly 400 more vessels had been damaged, many of them severely enough to need months of repair back in American shipyards. Close to 5,000 American sailors were dead, with roughly the same number wounded, a naval death toll higher than the U.S. Navy suffered at Pearl Harbor, inflicted almost entirely by pilots who had no intention of surviving the attacks that killed them. A fact that made the entire campaign feel, to the sailors living through it, less like a conventional battle and more like an extended siege with no way to strike back at the source of the threat. Japan, for its part, expended somewhere in the range of 1,800 to 1,900 kamikaze aircraft over the course of the campaign, the overwhelming majority of them destroyed before or during their attack runs, taking their pilots with them regardless of whether they ever actually reached a ship at all. The battle for Okinawa itself, on land, was every bit as brutal as the fight at sea, and the overall human cost of the entire campaign, soldiers, sailors, and above all else, Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire of a battle fought on their own home islands, is staggering even set against everything else the Pacific War had already produced. In the preliminary landings alone, days before the main invasion even began, Japanese soldiers forced hundreds of civilians on nearby islands into mass suicide rather than let them fall into American hands. A grim, deliberate preview of the coercion and terror that would go on to shape the civilian experience of the battle for its full 81 days. The memorial that lists the names of the dead from the battle records well over 240,000 individual names, the large majority of them Okinawan civilians, alongside tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and just over 14,000 Americans. It remains the bloodiest single battle of the entire Pacific War, and the ferocity of Japan's resistance there, the willingness to send pilots and ultimately an entire battleship on missions with no plan for survival at all, weighed directly on American planners as they considered what an actual invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. A calculation that fed directly into the decision, just weeks later, to use atomic weapons instead of attempting that invasion at all. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had overseen much of the Kamikaze air campaign from his headquarters on Kyushu, died leading one final kamikaze mission of his own on August 15, 1945, the very day Japan's surrender was announced. A fittingly grim final note to a campaign built entirely around the premise that there was no acceptable outcome except death or victory. If you want to hear the fuller story of the USS Franklin, hit by a conventional dive bomber attack under eerily similar circumstances to Bunker Hill's disaster just 2 months earlier, a fully loaded flight deck, a surprise strike, and hundreds of dead in the fires that followed, that's a video we've already made. Check the link in the description. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.